Today, I want to talk about how Jesus became God, and I want to approach this a little differently. I think Bart Ehrman has done an incredible job contributing to this conversation, but I kind of want to take a different direction. Because when I ask the question, how did Jesus become God? I'm not exactly willing to assume the historicity of Jesus in the first place. So today, we'll be approaching this with that in mind. So here's the more detailed version of our quest. How did a religious and literary figure called Jesus become historicized, increasingly divine, and eventually identified as God? That approach doesn't assume that a recoverable human founder existed beneath the literature. So before we begin, make sure to connect and like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you're really about that life, share the video as well. Let's jump in. I think we can start with the elephant in the room. There is no contemporary independent evidence. No surviving document securely datable to Jesus' alleged lifetime independently records Jesus of Nazareth, his ministry, his trial or crucifixion, his disciples, his resurrection, or the sudden public movement described in the book of Acts. There are no contemporary Roman records, inscriptions, personal letters, court documents, or even Jewish accounts confirming him. Everything used to reconstruct Jesus begins either inside Christian tradition or generations after the alleged events. Raphael Ladister's academic study concludes that the usual historicist case ultimately depends on New Testament text, hypothetical sources behind them, and disputed interpretations of Paul, not on a securely authentic contemporary witness. He argues that agnosticism is warranted because the required evidence simply is not available. Therefore, by my standard, Jesus is not an established historical person. He's an unverified figure located within later religious literature. And before you get upset and think that I'm reaching, let's not forget that just 100 years ago, many people believed that Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, and Moses were all real people. We now know that to be not the case. Now, that doesn't prove that no individual contributed to the tradition, but it does mean we can't responsibly promote that possibility into historical fact, at least not without ulterior motives. The earliest evidence is already mythological and theological. Paul's letters are the earliest surviving Christian writings, but Paul is not a biographer or eyewitness to an earthly ministry. His authority is explicitly revelatory. His Jesus is primarily known through visions and revelation, interpretations of Jewish scripture, heavenly authority, and an expected descent from heaven. The scattered phrases sometimes used to establish an earthly biography, like born of a woman, seed of David, brother of the Lord, crucifixion, and the supper tradition, are open to multiple interpretations and cannot be independently checked. So the earliest evidence doesn't give us a clearly documented teacher later transformed into a god. It gives us an already mythical saving figure whose alleged earthly life is largely absent. A more accurate sequence is therefore not necessarily human teacher, legendary teacher, divine Christ. It seems to instead have been revelatory or scriptural Christ figure, increasingly narrated earthly biography, mythic biography presented as recent history, and then incarnate God. The surviving evidence doesn't allow us to determine confidently whether a forgotten human stood at the beginning of that process. The Gospels are not independent eyewitness histories. The canonical Gospels are anonymous. You heard that right. Their familiar names were attached later between 130 and 180 CE. They were composed after the period they describe, and the synoptic Gospels are literally dependent rather than three independent confirmations. Modern literary research has also weakened the traditional assumption that the evangelists were community scribes preserving decades of collective oral memory. Robin Faith Walsh argues that the synoptic Gospels are better understood as creative literary works produced by educated writers after the Jewish War, operating within Greco-Roman networks and writing in conversation with biographies, histories, novels, and paradoxographical literature. That challenges the inherited model of eyewitness memories being carefully transmitted through early churches. M. David Litwood demonstrates that the Gospels use familiar techniques of mythic historiography, locating supernatural stories under known rulers, introducing supposed witnesses, staging doubt, supplying genealogies, even conflicting ones, and attaching wonders to recognizable places. These techniques give mythology a historical appearance. They don't verify that its central character existed. The Gospels therefore show that someone was creating and developing Jesus narratives. They do not independently establish the protagonist as historical. The Jesus narratives belong to the world of mythological sages and heroes. Now, I am in no way suggesting that Christianity copied one specific god or hero line by line. That would be an unnecessary oversimplification. I'm suggesting that the gospel Jesus is constructed from familiar ancient narrative types: the divinely conceived child, the threatened infant who escapes a ruler, the wonder working sage, the righteous lawgiver, the divine man misunderstood by ordinary folk, the healer and exorcist, the sacrificial victim, the hero whose death fulfills destiny, the missing or empty body, post-mortem appearances, recognition scenes, and ascent into the divine realm. These elements are eerily similar to the same types of stories that we were told about Heracles, Dionysus, Perseus, and even Romulus. Litwood directly compares gospel stories of incarnation, divine conception, miraculous childhood, wonders, transfiguration, empty tomb appearances, and ascent with Mediterranean mythic historiography. His point is not that the stories were perceived as fiction by their authors, but that ancient writers possessed established methods for presenting mythological events as history. Dennis MacDonald has additionally argued that parts of Mark and Acts imitate Homeric episodes, transforming Greek heroes and scenes so that Christian heroes appear superior. Some of his specific comparisons remain disputed, but the broader fact that early Christian authors wrote within and adapted Greco-Roman literary culture is no longer reasonably avoidable. The big point is, the gospel Jesus is not distinguishable as historical merely by the form of his stories. His biography is constructed using the same literary machinery through which ancient cultures historicized gods, heroes, sages, and mythical founders. The alleged non-Christian witnesses do not solve the problem. And I mean, they don't even come close to solving the problem. Not even if you put on my big ass glasses and squint willy hard. Let's start with Josephus. Josephus wrote Antiquities around 93 to 94 CE, roughly 6 decades after the alleged death of Jesus. He was not contemporary. The famous Testimonium Flavianum contains overtly Christian statements and has been disputed for centuries, literal centuries. Even positions preserving a partial Josephine core require reconstructing a hypothetical original beneath Christian alteration. A 2022 study argues that the passage can be explained as Josephus paraphrasing Christian material resembling Luke's Emmaus narrative, which would make it evidence of Christian tradition, not independent confirmation of a founder's existence. You see what they did there? A 2026 review by Josephus specialist Steve Mason notes that Josephus' early Jewish war says nothing about Jesus and rejects recent attempts to transform the later passage into eyewitness evidence. Even if Josephus composed some version of it, it was written in the 90s and its source remains unresolved. And then there's Tacitus. Tacitus wrote around 116 CE, approximately 80 years after the alleged events. Talk about a Johnny come lately. And the fly in every believer's soup here is that he doesn't even come close to revealing where he obtained his information about Christus. A 2023 study argues that Tacitus probably received his Christian information through Pliny, who learned what Christians believed by interrogating Christians. Under that reconstruction, Tacitus is not an independent Roman confirmation of Jesus. He is a later report of Christian claims, 80 years after the fact. But we can also talk about Pliny the Younger. Pliny, writing around 112 CE, confirms that Christians gathered and sang to Christ as to a god, which should be no surprise because this is exactly how cult groups behaved around their cult gods. He provides evidence for an early 2nd century cult, not for the existence of its alleged 1st century founder. Suetonius's reference to disturbances involving Christus is late and ambiguous. Again, Christus, not Christus. The true literary immaturity of believers is found in the fact that they can't understand that these could absolutely not only be two different names, but it could be, even if it was the same name, two different people. If I said someone named Mike was shot by the cops, you couldn't ascertain which Mike it was just by that information alone. You see, his reference may refer to a person then present in Rome, a misunderstanding of Christian disputes, or something else entirely. It doesn't document Jesus of Nazareth. Thus, the extra biblical evidence establishes only this: by the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, communities existed that believed in worshipped, and circulated stories about a mythical figure called Christ. That's evidence for Christians. It's not contemporary evidence for Jesus. Early Christianity cannot authenticate its own foundation. The reliability problem becomes more serious because deception, false attribution, and textual manipulation were not rare abnormalities within Christian literary production, which I think I've done a decent job at highlighting in quite a few of my videos. Go check those out. But hey, don't take my word for it. Oxford University Press's description of Bart Ehrman's comprehensive study of Christian forgery states that nearly half of the New Testament books makes false authorial claims. Go ahead and pause and think about that for a moment. Nearly half of New Testament books traditionally promoted as divinely inspired make false authorial claims. Yikes. I am not liking those averages. The study documents pseudonymous writings, forged apostolic letters, invented correspondence, fabricated narratives, false attribution of anonymous gospels, scribal falsification, and counter forgeries written to defeat other forged texts. Isn't that fun? These practices extended from New Testament writings through the 4th century and were employed to establish authority in doctrinal conflicts. This doesn't make every Christian sentence false. It means Christian tradition cannot function as a self-authenticating claim. A later Christian says an apostle said Jesus existed, therefore the apostle existed, therefore Jesus existed, therefore the later Christian account is reliable. That is circular at best and nonsensical at worst, perhaps even with a tad bit of delusion. So here's the big twist that I've been setting us up for in this conversation. Jesus became God may have begun before Jesus became a man. And I don't mean that in a coming of age sense, awkward sock in the pillow type of thing. Once we stop assuming an earthly founder, the development looks quite different. The earliest surviving Christian material already concerns a mythical Christ revealed through visions in scripture, killed and raised within a cosmic salvation narrative. The Gospels increasingly place this figure in a detailed recent past: towns, rulers, disciples, controversies, trials, and a tomb. Mythology acquires geography, chronology, and witnesses. Matthew and Luke add genealogies, conflicting ones, miraculous conception, prophecy fulfillment, and threatened child motifs. John identifies Jesus with a pre-existent divine word who existed before creation and temporarily became flesh. And then, decades later, centuries even, later Christians debated whether this figure was a man adopted by God, a subordinate heavenly being, a manifestation of the Father, or eternally identical in substance with God. We have to be absolutely clear about the implications of such. That means within the first 100 to 200 years of Jesus' alleged existence, that many Christians didn't even believe or support the idea that he was a human who walked this earth. Awkward. Imperial councils eventually established one answer as orthodoxy. The institutional process didn't prove that Jesus was God or that Jesus existed. It selected the authorized metaphysical interpretation of a figure already produced by centuries of ritual, literature, and theological conflict. So, with all of that being said, under a strict historical standard requiring contemporary, independent verification, we cannot establish that Jesus was a historical person who later became God. What we can trace is the development of the mythical Jesus figure. The earliest surviving sources present an already supernatural Christ known through revelation, ritual, and scripture. Later anonymous authors then construct increasingly elaborate earthly narratives about him. Those narratives use recognizable Jewish and Mediterranean mythological and literary forms. Later, non-Christian writers confirmed the existence of a growing cult of Christ, but not independently the existence of their founder. Christian authors repeatedly altered, forged, attributed, and suppressed texts while competing over authority. The victorious church eventually declared its version of the figure eternally divine and used institutional and imperial power to make that version normative. So my stance is this, and take note that I currently hold this to be the most responsible position on the matter. Jesus did not demonstrably begin as a historical man who was gradually mistaken for God. The evidence shows a divine literary and cultic figure who was progressively given a human biography, placed into recent history, and ultimately standardized as the God incarnate of imperial Christianity. Whether any identifiable person existed beneath that construction remains unverified. So the better question may not be, how did Jesus become God? It may be, how did Jesus become anything more than the fictional accounts the gospel narratives demonstrably present? Fan fiction is a hell of a drug. Congratulations for making it to the end of this video. Listen, I'm absolutely honored that you've chosen to share your time with me today. As much as I enjoy doing video essays like these on religious content, I don't do it because I think this is the most important conversation of modern times. As a matter of fact, my goal here is to play a small part in helping finally end this conversation so that humanity can not only let go of our former delusions, but continue to grow in our evolutionary capacity. That's why I dedicate my live streams on Sundays and Wednesdays to conversations around personal growth and community development. It's not just deconstruction, it's reconstruction and reorienting to the world that we want to see. It's through those conversations that we've really been able to make incredible progress and actually building community. Now, we call that community Bridge City. I'm sure you know by now. We have a growing online campus and local meetups developing across the nation and soon globe. Since last year, we've added several new team members focusing on community, arts, students, multimedia, and member experience. We have member sponsored clubs that span the gamut of interest on everything from books to wellness to politics and even nature. We have monthly game nights, house parties, and movie nights, which we're actually gearing up for the next one this Sunday night. It'd be cool if you drop in for a watch in the discussion. Now, Bridge City is not a church, but neither are we some type of atheist convention. We are a post religious community invested in the erection of third spaces and resources that help people connect, build, and live better. If that sparks your interest, don't wait another second. Use the QR code on the screen or the link in the description to join and help us build better bridges to better outcomes. Not for some of us, but for all of us. That's all the time I have for now. It's my absolute honor to share with you weekly. Until next time, y'all keep rising.